Rain smeared the windshield like a fogged memory, each wiper pass briefly clearing the blur before another sheet of drizzle replaced it. Leopold Vance leaned forward over the steering wheel, eyes heavy from another 12-hour shift. Nights like this always reminded him of how much quieter the world became after you'd lost everything that used to make noise. His wife's laughter, his son's footsteps, the click of the front door that would never open for him again. The rideshare app chimed, startling him. Pickup. City General Hospital. He sighed, rubbed the back of his neck, and turned onto the slick street. The hospital's fluorescent lights glowed like washed-out halos against the rain. A man stood near the curb under a bent umbrella, frail, gray, and hunched against the cold. Leopold pulled up, hit the unlock button, and called softly through the cracked window. "Evening, sir. Need a ride?" The man lowered his umbrella. His eyes, pale and watery, locked on Leopold's face. For a long, uneasy second, he didn't move. Then, with a tremor in his voice, he whispered, "My God!" Leopold frowned. "You all right?" The stranger's lips quivered. "You look—" He stopped himself, pressing a shaking hand to his mouth. "You look exactly like him." Leopold managed a polite half-smile, the kind you give strangers who say strange things. "Must be one of those faces. Where to?" The old man didn't answer right away. Instead, tears welled up and rolled down his cheeks. He reached out a trembling hand, almost touching Leopold's arm before withdrawing. 60 years, he murmured. "I've been waiting to see that face again." A flicker of unease ran through Leopold's chest. He gestured to the back seat. "Go ahead and sit. You'll catch a chill out there." The man nodded absently and climbed in, moving as though the air itself were fragile. As Leopold started the car, the man leaned forward from the back seat. His breath fogged the partition glass. "What's your name, son?" "Leopold. Leopold Vance." A sharp gasp filled the small space. Leopold caught it in the rearview mirror, eyes wide, the man's fingers gripping the edge of the seat as if holding onto time itself. "Vance," he whispered. "Did you say Vance?" Leopold's pulse quickened. "Yeah. Is something wrong?" The man's tears came harder now, his voice breaking. "He had your eyes. Your father, Harold Vance. I worked with him. My God, I thought you were gone too." Leopold blinked, confusion tightening his throat. "You knew my father?" The stranger nodded slowly. "He saved my life once. And then he disappeared." Leopold forced a chuckle, though it sounded brittle. "You must be mistaken. My father left when I was a kid. We never heard from him again." But the stranger only shook his head, eyes glinting with something like both grief and hope. "No mistake, son. Not this time." They drove in silence for the next few miles. The rain softened to a whisper, the city lights stretching like threads of gold through the mist. Leopold's hands tightened on the wheel. The old man's reflection in the mirror trembled, a ghost of another lifetime, breathing behind him. When they reached the address on the screen, the man didn't move to get out. He simply placed a crumpled business card on the center console. "Please," he said, voice frail but urgent. "Come by tomorrow. There are things you deserve to know. About him. About why he left." Leopold hesitated, torn between exhaustion and a strange, rising dread. Finally, he nodded. "All right." The old man's eyes glistened as he opened the door. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." The door shut softly, swallowed by the rain. Leopold watched him disappear under a flickering streetlight. Something cold settled in his chest, a feeling that what had just happened wasn't coincidence at all, but the first knock on a door he didn't know was still waiting to open. As he pulled back into traffic, the hospital lights faded in the mirror, and the stranger's trembling voice echoed in his mind. "He saved my life once, and then he disappeared." Leopold didn't know it yet, but that single sentence had just reopened a 60-year-old wound, and it would soon bleed through every part of his life. Leopold hardly slept that night. The old man's voice still echoed through the silence of his small apartment, the way it cracked when he'd said Harold Vance. His father's name. A name buried so deep in memory that hearing it aloud felt like dragging a ghost into the room. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold, staring at the business card the stranger had left. The print had faded, but the name was still legible. Alfred Cole. Underneath, an address scribbled in trembling handwriting. He turned the card over, thumb brushing against the indentation of the pen strokes. It wasn't just the handwriting that trembled, he realized. It had been the man himself, every movement unsteady, every breath heavy with something he couldn't name. Harold Vance. Leopold whispered the name into the empty room. It sounded foreign, like a word from a language he'd once known but forgotten. He tried to remember his father's face. He could recall the outline, the broad shoulders, the oil-stained hands from long hours at the machine shop, the faint smell of tobacco and sawdust. But the details were gone. Memory had blurred him, like a photograph left in the sun too long. He remembered the night his father disappeared. Rain had fallen then, too. His mother stood by the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other clutching a letter she never let him read. He'd watched from the stairs as his father walked out without looking back. The next morning, his mother said Harold was gone for work. Weeks passed, then years, and the story changed. Gone for good. Leopold never asked why. He'd learned early that some questions only reopened wounds that were already deep enough. Now, decades later, a stranger had spoken his father's name like it still mattered. By morning, curiosity outweighed fear. He typed Alfred Cole's address into his phone and saw it wasn't far. An older neighborhood near the river. As he drove, the city unfolded in shades of gray, the same palette of his memories. When he reached the address, an old brick duplex stood beneath a cluster of leafless trees. Curtains were drawn tight, but a thin line of light escaped through the bottom edge of one window. Leopold hesitated before knocking. The door opened almost immediately. Alfred stood there, smaller than he'd seemed in the car. His eyes, red-rimmed, tired, widened with something between relief and sorrow. "You came," he said softly. Leopold nodded. "You asked me to." Alfred's hands shook as he gestured him inside. The living room smelled faintly of mothballs and paper. Stacks of folders and old photographs covered the table, organized with a kind of desperate precision. "I didn't mean to frighten you yesterday," Alfred said, voice trembling. "It's just, when I saw your face, I thought I was seeing a ghost. You have his eyes. Harold's eyes." Leopold sat stiffly. "You keep saying you knew my father. How?" Alfred's fingers twitched as he reached for one of the folders. "We worked together once, a long time ago. Before everything went wrong." He paused, staring down at his own hands as if they might betray him. "He was a good man, your father. Better than most. And he didn't deserve what happened." Leopold's chest tightened. "What did happen?" Alfred looked up, eyes glassy. "That's not for me to say, not yet. You deserve to see the truth, not just hear it." He slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was a faded photograph. Two men standing side by side in front of a factory. One of them, unmistakably, was Harold Vance. Leopold's breath caught. The other man in the photo, younger but familiar, was Alfred. Alfred's voice wavered. "I've carried this picture for 60 years. I kept it because I couldn't forgive myself. Harold trusted me, and I failed him." Leopold looked up sharply, but Alfred had turned away, gripping the back of a chair with trembling hands. "Come back tomorrow," he whispered. "There's something you need to see. Something your father left behind." Leopold opened his mouth to question him, but Alfred's gaze drifted toward the window, distant, haunted. The old man's hands were still shaking, not from age, but from guilt. Leopold left the house with the photo in his pocket and the scent of dust and regret lingering in his coat. As he walked to his car, a sense of dread settled over him. He didn't know what Alfred meant, something your father left behind, but he knew one thing for certain: the past wasn't finished with him yet. And tomorrow, he would find out why. The photograph burned in Leopold's pocket all the way home. Rain still clung to his coat when he stepped inside his apartment, a small, second-floor unit that smelled faintly of dust and instant coffee. He shut the door behind him, leaned his back against it, and let the quiet swallow him whole. Alfred's trembling voice looped in his mind. Your father trusted me, and I failed him. He unbuttoned his coat and sat heavily on the couch, the springs groaning beneath his weight. The city hummed outside the window, but in the apartment, time felt frozen. He pulled out the old photograph and studied it under the lamp's dull light. There they were, his father, Harold Vance, and Alfred Cole, both younger, proud, smiling at something just out of frame. His father's arm rested on Alfred's shoulder as if they were brothers. But why had he never mentioned this man? Leopold rubbed his thumb across the faded paper, tracing the edge where it had begun to tear. He thought of how little he truly knew about his father, the man who had built their house with his own hands, who taught him to ride a bike, who disappeared one night and left nothing but silence behind. He had searched for answers once. Letters, police records, old neighbors. Every lead led nowhere. Eventually, grief hardened into something quieter. Not acceptance, just survival. Now, decades later, Alfred had torn open the one place Leopold had sealed shut. He stood, restless, and switched on the attic light. The bulb flickered once before glowing weakly. Boxes lined the narrow space beneath the slanted roof. Dusty, unmarked, forgotten. Leopold crouched and began opening them one by one. Inside, time spilled out in fragments. His late wife Patrice's scarves, his son's school drawings, unpaid bills yellowed at the edges. Then, beneath a stack of brittle newspapers, he found a tin box he didn't remember keeping. Inside lay photographs, letters, and a child's wooden toy, the one his father had carved for him before he vanished. Leopold held it in both hands, its smooth edges worn from years of play. A memory surfaced, Patrice laughing softly as their sons raced down the hallway, wooden toys clattering against the floor. Her voice echoing, "You'll spoil them, Leo, just like your father did you." His chest tightened. Patrice had believed in him once, before his business failed, before their sons grew to resent his mistakes. They blamed him for everything, for losing the house, for letting grief swallow what was left of their family. He couldn't blame them. He'd built walls instead of bridges. Now, looking at the toy, he wondered if his father had done the same. Leopold set it down beside the photo of Harold and Alfred. The two men stared back at him through the decades, one gone without goodbye, the other trembling under the weight of guilt. "Why didn't you tell me, Dad?" he whispered into the still air. The attic light flickered again, dimming to a soft pulse before steadying. Leopold gathered the items carefully, as though touching them too roughly might erase what little truth they held. When he descended the stairs, he placed the photo on his kitchen table. Tomorrow, Alfred would explain, or confess. Either way, Leopold knew there was no turning back. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, and the old pipes in the walls groaned like something waking from a long sleep. The past was stirring again. The next morning arrived gray and brittle, like a page too old to turn. Leopold sat in his car outside Alfred's house for several minutes, the engine idling, breath fogging the windshield. The photograph from the attic lay on the passenger seat beside him. Every time he looked at it, the past felt closer, pressing against the present like a bruise. He wasn't sure why he'd come back. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt, maybe both. Finally, he shut off the engine and walked up the narrow path to the porch. The wooden steps creaked beneath his weight. Before he could knock, the door opened. Alfred stood there, already waiting, his expression a fragile mix of relief and regret. "You came," Alfred said, voice hoarse. "I said I would," Leopold replied. The old man nodded, motioning him inside. The house was quiet, thick with the scent of dust and lemon polish. Sunlight filtered weakly through lace curtains, settling on a table cluttered with papers, photographs, and coffee cups gone cold. Alfred's hands trembled as he cleared a space. "I didn't sleep last night," he murmured. "Too many ghosts in these walls." Leopold tried to smile, but it faltered. "You said you knew my father, that you worked together." Alfred hesitated, then opened a drawer in a nearby cabinet. Inside were stacks of brittle newspaper clippings, neatly bundled with yellowed string. Headlines jumped out in faded ink. Local engineer missing after financial scandal. Harold Vance accused of embezzlement from Pierce Manufacturing. Industrial partner found dead. Police suspect foul play. Leopold felt his stomach tighten. Embezzlement? That can't be right. Alfred pulled out a folder and laid it on the table. Inside were black and white photographs of factory floors, contracts, and 2 signatures side by side, Harold Vance and Eleanor Pierce. She was the co-founder of the company, Alfred explained, tapping the name. A brilliant woman. And she trusted your father more than anyone. They built Pierce Manufacturing together, side by side. But when the company's money started disappearing, the board needed someone to blame. Harold was an easy target. Leopold shook his head slowly. You're saying my father was innocent? I'm saying he was framed, Alfred said firmly. His hands shook harder now as he reached for another clipping. Harold didn't run because he was guilty. He ran because they would have killed him if he stayed. The words hit like a hammer. Killed him. Alfred nodded, eyes glossy. There was more to that scandal than missing money. There was a deal, one that went wrong. Your father discovered it. And the people involved made sure his silence was permanent. Leopold's throat went dry. Who? Who are you talking about? Alfred's gaze drifted toward a framed photograph on the mantel, a black and white image of a woman in her 40s, elegant, composed, standing beside 2 men in suits. That's Eleanor Pierce, he said quietly. And those 2 men were her partners. One of them ended up dead. The other, well, he disappeared. Leopold stared at the photo, a shiver crawling up his spine. And my father? Alfred swallowed hard. He tried to expose what they were doing. He kept records, copies of everything. He hid them somewhere, said he'd come back for them. But he never did. Leopold glanced down at the papers, the ink smudged by Alfred's trembling fingers. You're telling me my father died because of this? I wish I weren't. Alfred sank into a chair, his shoulders sagging beneath invisible weight. They called it an accident, but I know better. He trusted me to keep his secret safe, and I failed him. Leopold looked at the fragile man before him, the shaking hands, the watery eyes. Part of him wanted to believe the story, to think his father had been more than the man who walked away. But another part of him resisted, clinging to disbelief like armor. Why tell me now? He asked softly. Because the people who wanted him gone are gone themselves, Alfred whispered. And because his son deserves to know the truth before I follow them. Outside, the sky rumbled, distant thunder rolling over the rooftops. Leopold folded one of the clippings carefully, as if it might fall apart at his touch. He didn't see it yet, but in one of the photographs on the table, behind his father and Eleanor Pierce, a shadowed figure stood near the factory gate, watching. And that shadow was about to lead him deeper into a story that wasn't finished being told. The thunder from earlier still rolled faintly in the distance when Alfred disappeared into the next room. Leopold sat at the cluttered table, staring at the newspaper clippings spread before him. Every headline felt heavier now, as if each one had been waiting years to be read aloud. Alfred returned carrying a small, leather-bound ledger. Its cover was cracked, edges frayed, the paper yellowed by time. A brass key dangled from a thin string tied around it. He placed it gently before Leopold, his hand trembling the way it had the night they met. This, Alfred said, voice uneven, is what your father died for. Leopold frowned. A book. Not just a book, Alfred whispered. A record. He wrote everything down, every payment, every name, every transfer that passed through Pierce Manufacturing before it all went wrong. He found something he wasn't supposed to see. Leopold turned the brittle pages carefully. Rows of numbers filled the margins, but they weren't straightforward. Some were circled, others marked with small triangles or underlined in red pencil. Next to them, initials appeared, HV, EP, and several he didn't recognize. It's coded, Alfred continued. Your father used symbols for each department, each person involved. He told me it was safer that way. If anyone found it, they'd think it was an inventory list. Leopold flipped to the final pages. A single line, written in fading ink, caught his attention. Ledger secured. Key, Unit 13, River Storage. He looked up. This key opens that unit, Alfred said quietly. I've kept it all these years, but I couldn't bring myself to go back. Everything Harold hid, the truth, the money, maybe even proof of who set him up, it's all there. Leopold studied him. And now you're giving it to me. Why? Alfred sank into his chair, the exhaustion on his face deeper than before. Because I'm dying, Mr. Vance. I've carried this guilt too long. I helped forge the numbers that made your father look guilty. I told myself I was protecting the company, but really, I was protecting myself. Leopold's chest tightened. So you framed him. I didn't mean to, Alfred said, shaking his head. They pressured me, threatened me. When Harold found out, he begged me to tell the truth. The next day, he was gone. Leopold pushed back from the table, anger and disbelief colliding inside him. You expect me to forgive that? No, Alfred said softly. I expect you to understand that I've spent 60 years trying to atone. I kept his ledger safe. I watched the company fall apart from the inside. Every dollar they stole, every life it ruined, I saw it happen. Leopold stared down at the book, its pages breathing faintly in the still air. He could almost imagine his father's hands writing those lines, determined and defiant. If I go to this storage unit, Leopold said finally, what will I find? Alfred's eyes glistened. Answers. Maybe redemption. Or maybe the reason men like your father never live long enough to see either. A silence stretched between them, the kind that carried both warning and promise. Leopold slipped the key into his pocket and stood. Then I guess I'll find out. Alfred's voice followed him to the door, faint but trembling with something like relief. Be careful, Leopold. Some truths aren't buried, they're guarded. Outside, the storm had finally broken. The rain began again, steady and cold, as Leopold walked toward his car, the ledger tucked under his arm, and the ghost of his father whispering somewhere behind the thunder. The rain hadn't stopped by morning. It followed Leopold like a shadow, tapping the windshield, whispering against the hood, filling every silence with its own restless rhythm. He parked outside River Storage, a row of weather-beaten metal units along the edge of the industrial district. The air smelled of rust and wet pavement. His breath fogged in the chill as he stepped out, clutching the small brass key Alfred had given him. Unit 13 was near the end of the row, a dented blue door, paint peeling like old skin. Leopold hesitated before fitting the key into the lock. The tumblers clicked with a sound that seemed too loud in the empty lot. When he lifted the rolling door, dust and cold air spilled out, thick with the scent of oil and time. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its chain swaying slightly. The light flickered once before revealing a small table, a few crates, and against the back wall, a gray metal safe. Leopold's heartbeat quickened. The safe was old, heavy, its paint chipped to the steel beneath. He knelt beside it and brushed his sleeve over the dial, uncovering faint numbers scratched into the surface. 17, 41, 3. It took 3 tries before the mechanism gave a tired click. The door creaked open, releasing a faint metallic sigh, as if relieved to finally be touched again. Inside were stacks of folders tied with twine, several envelopes, and a small wooden box. Leopold pulled them out carefully, laying them on the floor. When he opened the box, he froze. A revolver rested inside, its metal dull with age. A tag tied to the trigger guard bore his father's name, Harold Vance. Leopold's hands shook as he lifted the weapon. The serial number was etched deep and clear. He had never seen it before, but something about the weight of it felt intimate, personal. Beneath the gun was a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the faded type. Police report. Case number 4189. Death of Robert Pierce. Weapon recovered, Smith & Wesson .38 Special. Registered to Harold Vance. Findings. No fingerprints recovered. Blood type on weapon inconsistent with victims. Investigation inconclusive. Leopold stared at the report until the letters blurred. The world around him seemed to narrow, the rain, the flickering light, the silence pressing against his ears. If his father's prints weren't on the weapon, then he hadn't fired the shot. Someone else had. He sat back on the concrete floor, the cold seeping through his jeans. Alfred's words replayed in his mind. Your father found something he wasn't supposed to see. On impulse, he opened one of the folders. Inside were contracts, handwritten notes, and photographs of factory equipment stamped with company logos. In the margins, his father had scribbled numbers and names. Pierce, Cole, EP, assets diverted. The ledger had been real. The evidence, damning. Leopold placed the papers back into the safe, careful not to disturb the order. He took only the report and the revolver, locking the door behind him as thunder rumbled across the river. Back in his car, he stared through the windshield at the rain-blurred world ahead. His reflection stared back, tired eyes, the ghost of his father's face behind them. The truth was no longer buried. It was waiting, loaded, in his hands. And if Alfred was right, if this was only part of what his father left behind, then someone else, somewhere, already knew he'd opened the door. Leopold spent the night staring at the revolver on his kitchen table. The police report lay beside it, its faded words replaying in his mind like a riddle he couldn't solve. No fingerprints. Inconclusive. If his father hadn't fired the gun, then who had? By morning, the city felt heavier. The rain had stopped, but everything else, the clouds, the air, his thoughts, remained gray. He brewed coffee, tried to focus on the hum of the machine, when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Mr. Vance? My name is Clara Pierce. I think we need to talk. The surname hit him like a jolt. Pierce. As in Eleanor Pierce, the woman from the photograph on Alfred's mantel. He called the number back immediately. A woman's voice answered, calm but distant. You don't know me, she said, but my grandmother's name was Eleanor Pierce. I believe you've been speaking with Alfred Cole. Leopold hesitated. How do you know about that? He called me years ago, she replied. Said one day, someone named Vance would come looking for answers. He told me to keep something safe for you. Leopold's pulse quickened. What kind of something? Why don't you come find out? They agreed to meet at a cafe downtown. When Leopold arrived, Clara was already there, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, with a quiet confidence that reminded him of a photograph he'd once seen of Eleanor Pierce. She stood as he approached, extending a hand. Leopold Vance, she said softly. You really do look like him. He sat opposite her, uneasy. Everyone keeps saying that. Him who, my father? She nodded. Harold Vance. My grandmother used to talk about him. Said he was the only man who ever understood her work. Leopold frowned. Work? You mean the company? Yes, but more than that, Clara said, lowering her voice. They were partners. And they were in love. The words struck like cold water. That's not possible. My father was married. He had a family. Clara met his gaze without flinching. I know. But it happened. My grandmother tried to end it when things turned dangerous. Alfred couldn't stand it. He'd loved her for years. When he found out about them, he lost control. Leopold's breath caught. You're saying Alfred? Clara slid a thin folder across the table. Inside were copies of old letters, photographs, and one envelope sealed with wax. These are my grandmother's. She wrote them after the scandal. The last one, she never sent. Leopold unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was elegant but rushed. Harold, they're watching us. Alfred knows. I fear what he might do. If anything happens, protect the ledger. It's our only proof. The air around him seemed to thin. She knew, he whispered. She knew what they were planning. Clara nodded. The board blamed your father for everything. Embezzlement, the murder of Robert Pierce. But it was Alfred who arranged it all. He covered it up to save himself and the company. My grandmother never forgave him. That's why he called me later, to fix what was broken, as he said. Leopold's voice hardened. And now he wants me to clean his conscience. Clara looked at him with quiet sadness. Maybe. Or maybe he wanted you to understand that your father wasn't the man you thought he was. He was better. Leopold leaned back, staring through the cafe window. The street outside shimmered in the afternoon light, people moving like shadows in motion. "Eleanor Pierce and my father," he murmured. "That's why Alfred kept her photograph." Clara nodded. He couldn't forget either of them. For a long moment, they sat in silence, bound by names older than both their lives. Finally, Clara slid a small key across the table. "There's something else. My grandmother left this in her will, a box in her private archives. I never opened it. Maybe it's time someone did." Leopold took the key, its metal cold against his palm. "What's in it?" "I don't know," Clara said. "But if Alfred was right, it might prove who really pulled the trigger." Leopold stared down at the key, the weight of 2 generations pressing against his chest. Outside, thunder rumbled again, faint but approaching. The past, it seemed, wasn't done speaking yet. By the time Leopold reached Alfred's house again, the sun was sinking behind the rooftops, painting the clouds the color of rust and fire. He had Clara's key in his pocket, but first, there were questions that only one man could still answer. He knocked once, twice. No response. The third time, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the lights were dim, the air thick with the faint hum of an old radio. Alfred sat slumped in his armchair, pale, his breathing shallow. A small recorder blinked red on the table beside him, its tape spinning in a slow loop. "Alfred," Leopold said softly. The old man stirred, lifting his head. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken but still sharp enough to recognize him. "I was hoping you'd come," he rasped. "Did you find Clara?" Leopold nodded, stepping closer. "I did. She told me everything. About my father, about Eleanor." A faint smile flickered across Alfred's lips, half sorrow, half relief. "Then it's finally out." Leopold's voice trembled. "You said my father was framed. That you were part of it. I need to hear it from you." Alfred's hand shook as he reached for the recorder. "You will. I wanted it all, on record. The truth." He pressed play. His own voice crackled from the speaker, weak but clear. "My name is Alfred Cole. I am guilty of forgery, obstruction, and deceit. 60 years ago, I changed the numbers that ruined Harold Vance. He found out and came to confront me the night Robert Pierce died. There was an argument, a struggle. He tried to take the gun from me. It went off." Leopold's breath hitched. He looked at Alfred, who was staring at the floor, tears sliding down the deep lines of his face. "I didn't mean to kill him," the recording continued. "But I was too afraid to face what I'd done. Eleanor covered for me, said Harold had fled. She buried the truth to protect the company. And I let her." The tape clicked, the sound of silence louder than any word. Leopold's fists clenched. "You killed him," he whispered. "You let my mother die thinking he'd abandoned us." Alfred nodded weakly. "I know. Every day since, I've seen his face. I searched for you to make it right, but there's no right left in me." Leopold turned away, his throat burning. The photograph of his father and Alfred still hung crooked on the wall, 2 men frozen before betrayal. "Why now?" he asked quietly. "Because I don't have time," Alfred said, his voice breaking. "And because you do. The ledger, the safe, the reports, they'll clear his name. Promise me you'll use them. Don't let him stay a ghost." Leopold's anger melted into something heavier. Sorrow. He knelt beside the chair, gripping Alfred's cold hand. "He deserved better," he whispered. "I know," Alfred murmured. "So did you." The last light of day slipped through the blinds, striping the room in fading gold. When Leopold finally looked up, Alfred's eyes were closed, his chest still. The recorder's tape had stopped spinning. Leopold sat there in silence, tears blurring the edges of everything. Rage, grief, forgiveness, until they were all the same color. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, one by one, ushering in the darkness. And somewhere in his pocket, the small key Clara had given him pressed cold against his palm, a reminder that the truth wasn't finished yet. The bloodline clause at exactly 500 words, keeping the tone tense and the stakes high, while ensuring a smooth narrative transition from the previous chapter and leading naturally into the next. Chapter 9. The Bloodline Clause. The room smelled faintly of old paper and dust, the ledger open on the oak table like a relic demanding reverence. Leopold's hands shook as he traced the faded ink with a fingertip, reading aloud the words that had eluded them for so long. It says here," he whispered, voice taut with disbelief, "the rightful heir's bloodline shall inherit the company, once the truth is proven." Clara leaned over his shoulder, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This is it," she said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the discovery. "This clause. It validates everything Harold stood for. If we present this properly, we can clear his name and secure the inheritance legally." Leopold exhaled, the weight of years of guilt and uncertainty pressing on him. "And yet, I feel the walls closing in. The Pierce family," he paused, swallowing hard. "They won't let this happen quietly. They've thrived in shadows for decades." Clara nodded. "We need evidence beyond the ledger. Correspondence, notarized documents, witnesses. Everything. It has to be airtight. Anything less, and they'll bury it, or worse, discredit us entirely." The room fell silent, save for the faint scratching of a pen as Clara began cataloging every detail they could find. Each document felt heavier than the last, the gravity of the stakes pressing down on them. Leopold couldn't stop his mind from wandering to Harold, the man whose life had been destroyed by false accusations, whose reputation had been smeared by lies, and whose death now weighed on Leopold like a silent indictment. Hours passed. By the dim light of a single desk lamp, they compiled the proof. Letters that tied the Pierce family to forged contracts, entries from the old company ledger corroborating Harold's legitimate claims, and witness statements from employees too loyal, or too frightened, to speak until now. Each piece was a nail in the coffin of the Pierce family's carefully constructed deception. Just as they prepared to file the evidence, a sharp knock echoed through the office. Leopold froze. Clara glanced at the door. "It's too early for anyone else," she muttered. A shadow fell across the threshold, unmistakably deliberate and menacing. Leopold felt a chill run down his spine. "They've already found out we're digging," he murmured. Clara clenched her fists. "Then we move fast. We can't let fear dictate our actions now. Harold deserves justice, and the truth won't wait for their permission." Leopold nodded, determination hardening his features. As they gathered the documents, ready to confront the legacy of lies and greed, the weight of the clause seemed to hum in the room, as if the company itself demanded reckoning. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying a warning, yet also a promise. The battle for truth had begun, and there would be no turning back. Word count: 500. If you want, I can also draft Chapter 10's opening paragraph so that it flows seamlessly from this tense cliffhanger with the Pierce family looming as a threat. That way the story momentum remains unbroken. Do you want me to do that next? The courthouse was colder than Leopold remembered, the stone walls echoing with decades of whispered deals and silenced truths. Papers rustled like restless ghosts in the hands of clerks and lawyers, a prelude to the storm that was about to break. Leopold's heart pounded, but his resolve had never been firmer. He had come not for wealth, not for recognition, but for the one thing that had been stolen from his family: his father's name. The proceedings opened with formalities that felt almost performative, but when the first witness took the stand, the room shifted. A former accountant of the old company stepped forward, eyes darting nervously between the Pierce lawyers and Leopold. I signed the ledgers under duress," he admitted, voice trembling. "I was told to make Harold appear culpable. If I had refused..." His sentence trailed, heavy with implication, leaving a silence that carried decades of injustice. Leopold clenched his fists but remained seated, letting the truth land where it would. After him, another employee spoke, this one braver, emboldened by Harold's posthumous vindication. She described forged documents, manipulated contracts, and threats from the Pierce family to anyone who spoke against them. Each revelation carved away the veneer of invincibility surrounding the powerful, and Leopold felt the weight of past suffering lift slightly from his shoulders. When it was his turn, Leopold stood before the courtroom. The Pierce lawyers, sharp suits and sharper tongues, tried to sway him with insinuations, subtle threats, and hints of settlements. "Consider what is offered," one said smoothly, "for the sake of peace." Leopold's gaze hardened. "I am not here for wealth," he said, voice steady and clear, reverberating across the polished courtroom. "I am here for the truth. I am here so that my father, Harold Vance, can finally be cleared of crimes he did not commit. No sum of money can undo the injustice he endured, but truth can." A murmur ran through the room, some in disbelief, some in reluctant admiration. The judge's gavel struck sharply, restoring order, and the trial pressed on, each document and witness tightening the noose of accountability around the Pierce family. Leopold felt exhaustion creeping in, but he did not falter. The moral weight of the fight was heavier than fatigue, and he bore it willingly. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom was thick with tension. The Pierce lawyers whispered among themselves, calculating, desperate, yet powerless against a tide they had long underestimated. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the courthouse windows, carrying an air of reckoning. Leopold stepped into the hall, feeling the sting of long-suppressed tears. He had not yet won, justice would not be instant, but he had already reclaimed something invaluable, the right to stand for truth, unshaken by fear or corruption. And in that quiet moment, he understood that the trial was not just about inheritance or ledgers, but about legacy, conscience, and the redemption of a name long maligned. Tomorrow the court would continue, but Leopold walked out knowing that the first light of justice had pierced decades of darkness. The sky was a muted gray, heavy with clouds that seemed to mourn alongside the small gathering at Alfred's graveside. Leopold stood with Clara at his side, the wind tugging gently at his coat, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The ceremony was brief, almost unbearably quiet, but every word felt weighted with the history of mistakes, regrets, and unspoken confessions. As the coffin was lowered, Leopold's thoughts drifted to the ledger, to the trial, to the long and painful path that had led them here. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but here, standing over Alfred's ashes, the victory felt smaller, tinged with sorrow. The man who had caused so much turmoil, who had framed Harold, yet had confessed in the end, was gone. After the mourners dispersed, a small, unmarked box was left for Leopold by the funeral home. Inside he found a familiar weight, his father's old watch, polished but worn at the edges, and a folded note in Alfred's handwriting. Leopold unfolded it carefully, his fingers trembling. "You deserved the truth, not the burden." The word struck him like a quiet echo, carrying both apology and acknowledgement. Leopold held the watch for a long moment, feeling the steady rhythm of its ticking as if it were a heartbeat linking him to the father he had lost and the father he had fought to honor. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see his sons, tall and somber, standing a respectful distance away. They had rarely been close, estranged by years of misunderstandings and the shadow of family conflicts. Yet now, in the presence of loss and truth, they were here, silently acknowledging the strength and integrity their father had carried through every trial. Leopold lifted the watch to the sky, letting the muted light reflect off its face. This is the inheritance," he said softly, voice almost drowned by the wind. "Not wealth, not titles, but the truth, and the strength to live with it." For a moment, the world felt balanced, the burdens of the past settling like ashes in the air. Generations, once divided by mistakes and pride, seemed to breathe together in quiet reconciliation. Leopold tucked the watch into his coat pocket, the note folded carefully beside it, and turned to walk away, feeling the weight of legacy now tempered by understanding and the fragile, enduring peace of closure. The man in the mirror. The city streets were quiet, bathed in the soft amber glow of late afternoon. Leopold's hands gripped the steering wheel loosely, the hum of the engine a gentle rhythm beneath the weight of memories. Passing City General Hospital again, he felt a strange mix of nostalgia and relief. The place where life had been fragile, decisions had been made, and revelations had finally brought justice. As he slowed at the curb, a boy stepped into the frame. He looked no older than 10, with sharp eyes and an inquisitive gaze that seemed to pierce right through Leopold. The boy hesitated for a moment, then opened the door and climbed into the passenger seat without a word. Leopold glanced at him in surprise, but there was no fear, no suspicion in the boy's demeanor. Instead, there was a familiarity, an echo of someone he once had been, a child full of questions, quiet resilience, and a hunger for truth. The sight tugged at something deep within him, a reminder that the cycle of pain and discovery did not have to continue forever. He started the car again, and for a while, they drove in companionable silence. The boy watched the city pass by with wide eyes, occasionally pointing at a building or a street corner, while Leopold's mind drifted over the years. The battles fought, the family restored, the names cleared, and the burdens laid to rest. Finally, at a red light, Leopold's gaze flicked to the rear-view mirror. His own reflection stared back at him, older, worn, yet tempered with the quiet strength of someone who had endured loss, embraced truth, and found peace. His throat tightened, and he whispered, almost to himself, "Dad, I finally found you." The words lingered in the car, mingling with the faint scent of leather and the hum of the engine. In that moment, Leopold understood that the journey had never been only about justice, inheritance, or vindication. It had been about reconciliation, with the past, with those lost, and with himself. The boy in the seat beside him turned slightly, as if understanding more than words could convey, and smiled. Leopold returned it, a small, unburdened smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. As the light turned green, the car rolled forward, and Leopold felt the future stretch ahead, uncharted but no longer intimidating. He no longer chased ghosts, nor carried guilt that was not his to bear. He was simply a man at peace, finally able to meet himself, and the world, in full reflection.